Okay, so we've had to rearrange some of the talks because certain people couldn't come. What we have today is I'll introduce the talks at the end of this brief introductory session. We have 4 talks today, and the theme is small-scale mining in Sub-Saharan Africa and how that links to the Sustainable Development Goals. So you have the summary of this panel, which aims to talk about how a formalized artisanal and small-scale mining sector can contribute positively in many ways to the Sustainable Development Goals. And as I talk and the panelists talk more and more, it'll quickly be realized that this is a neglected sector of industry, when there are boatloads of opportunities, really, if we were to focus more of our energies into formalizing this sector, because as you'll see, it's a very, very important sector of industry, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. So going about, just to talk briefly about the type of work we've been doing, I've been fortunate to have worked with a number of talented researchers over the past 20 or so years, and all of whom, well, some of whom are here, not all, but some. Some could make it, and there are others working in this space across the globe. So we've been carrying out research on the environmental and interrelated social aspects of artisanal and small-scale mining, mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa, for 15 to 20 years in a number of countries, including Ghana, Mali, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Rwanda, Tanzania, Mozambique, and DR Congo. The list goes on, and this research has yielded some very interesting findings about a sector not many people in the world understand. And for those who have tried to understand what's going on in the sector, many have misinterpreted what's going on in the sector. Among some of our findings, our key findings, most significant findings include the fact that this is the most important rural non-farm activity in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in many situations, in many places in that part of the world, it's replaced agriculture as the main income earning activity, which is significant because for those of you who know a thing or two about donor aid in Sub-Saharan Africa, most of it's oriented around supporting smallholder farming. Okay? And it's totally neglected in policy, this sector. You know, we don't like it. It's not a very clean sector. There's a lot of mess there. And as development people, in many cases, we don't like dealing with messy situations, okay? So we aim through our work to broaden understanding of the sector's role in Sub-Saharan Africa, its economic importance and cultural significance. Some of the key overlooked areas that we've shed light on, or we've improved understanding of this, is this interconnection between farming and mining. In many cases, well, I mean, there are limited growing seasons in some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. You can only grow certain parts of the year. What are you doing in the other parts of the year? You're doing something else. And in many cases, we've seen that this farming is interlinked with mining and capital and labor sort of flow across the board, depending on what season it is. And if you look at the household, different people are doing different things. These are complex microeconomies and employment engines. We're not talking only about small-scale mining and direct employment. We're talking about the many millions of more people that are employed in the downstream and in upstream industries that sector spawns. And this is significant because when we're talking about extractive industries, we're generally talking about enclave economies. So these large-scale mining setups in Africa and other parts of the developing world, because they're so capital intensive, there's very few jobs that are created. So this is very significant as far as employment goes and income generation goes in poor parts of the world. And there's a sort of an inseparable link with poverty. I mean, we can't separate the two. This is a poverty-driven sector in many cases. There are people who are mining who have nothing else to do. It's poverty alleviating in many situations, and many people find themselves caught in a poverty trap once they get in this sector, because as we'll see, 99% of this sector, probably more, of the people involved in this sector are operating informally, okay? They're operating in the informal economy. And when you're in the informal economy, the regulations, the government presence is virtually non-existent, and there are a number of different very interesting actors who control that space as a result of that lack of presence. So in terms of building a case for formalizing, there's the old arguments. If we're going to build this case, look at the employment angle, okay? There's so many people employed in this sector directly and so many people dependent upon this sector for their livelihoods. That's one way of looking at it, okay? One strand of this case. And we really don't know how many people are employed because we haven't done a proper census, but based on what estimates have been given, which are completely outdated, the estimates provided certainly show, certainly illustrate that a significant number of people are in fact employed in this sector. It's also a platform for wealth creation. Even in the informal economy, we see people who are using this sector creatively to branch out into other industries, you know, to put up a chemical dispensary in a village, to set up an FM radio station, to set up their own taxi service. So it's a very, very important platform for wealth creation in parts of the world where there are no jobs, very, very few income earning opportunities. And it's obviously an integral part of rural livelihoods in not only sub-Saharan Africa, but other parts of the developing world. And as I've indicated, you know, there are numbers out there. We don't exactly know how many people are mining in this or employed directly in this sector. The latest estimates are like 35 million. You know, 150 million people dependent upon this sector for their livelihoods. And it makes sense in terms of the upstream and downstream, because for every person that's employed, he or she has to be fed, his or her equipment has to be serviced, they have to get to site somehow, their clothes have to be washed and provided, there's people repairing this equipment, so it is an unrivaled employment engine in poor parts of the world. And this sort of shows you diagrammatically what we're talking about. If we're looking at small-scale gold mining and the downstream and upstream industries, you have all these different types of people working in this sector. It's an eclectic group of people. Unskilled, skilled, university graduates, people. I've interviewed people with master's degrees that, you know, if you just saw a picture of them, you'd like, oh, this is like an illiterate farmer or whatever, but you get talking to them, they have a master's degree from Europe or North America. There's simply no jobs in sub-Saharan Africa, as most of you are probably aware. It's the, you know, youth unemployment is probably the biggest development issue in that part of the world today. And these guys are mining pretty much everything, okay? It's low tech, so obviously they're targeting very specific deposits, but to give you an idea, they're mining alluvial diamonds. Gold is by far the biggest segment of the sector. There's industrial minerals, there's colored gemstones, whatever you can get at with a shovel and a pick. So, and there's, you know, if you're talking about gold, we're talking about the most tradable commodity in the world. It's worth the same everywhere you go, okay? With colored gemstones and diamonds, a bit different, but gold, you know, whatever price it is here, it's the same price in Ghana, it's the same price everywhere, okay? So back to our case, these are the old arguments, and we're finding that we're sort of not, these arguments are now falling upon deaf ears in many cases. Many people are not willing to listen anymore, so we have to be sort of more creative with our arguments when it comes to building the case to formalize this sector. And we strongly believe that packaging these ideas in more of a sort of sustainable development goals speak is the way to go. And looking at, you know, pursuing fresh angles of attack, speaking to the sustainable development goals apparatus, and in particular, the themes underpinning the sustainable development goals, namely food security, gender, youth and job creation, and the environment, okay? And these are some of the core themes that underpin the sustainable development goals. And we're gonna be doing a lot of that today with the talks that are being presented on this panel. Now, again, I've had to reshuffle things a bit, sorry. So what I've done is my talk will be first, I'll be introducing myself, which is kind of weird. But my talk will be first, and I've had to take a couple steps back because a lot of the other speakers who we're going to cover sort of some of the background stuff obviously aren't here, so I'm going to take a couple steps back and cover that terrain, and then we'll go into some of the more specific issues. So there'll be 4 talks. First me, then Josh Sandin, who's a PhD student at Royal Holloway, then Cynthia Kumah, who's a PhD student at Carleton University, who we've been working with for a few years, Martin Clifford, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Delaware, whose PhD I supervise at the University of Reading, so that's pretty emotional. So we have 4 good talks, and hopefully we'll galvanize some interest in artisanal and small-scale mining through these presentations. So I'll start now with mine. Right, okay, so this is sort of a general conceptual lay of the land. And what I'm going to be talking about today is more or less on the formalization of artisanal and small-scale mining, and how formalizing artisanal and small-scale mining provides us with a platform for doing a lot of things as far as the Sustainable Development Goals are concerned. Okay, so this is all about, I guess, helping to showcase an industry that's been, I think, misbranded, and a sector that a lot of people misunderstand. Okay, so what's good for us as far as this argument is concerned is that a lot of the donor interventions are framed in a way in which sort of formalization is the goal. So this is the end goal of a lot of interventions. It's just the process that in many cases is fundamentally flawed because, again, of a poor understanding of the dynamics of this sector. And, it takes a lot of work to figure out what's going on in a rural community, to broaden understanding of the linkages between farming and mining, to figure out what different people are doing in the household over a full calendar year. That takes a lot of work, ethnographic work, a lot of semi-structured interviews, a lot of gathering of data, a lot of time, which we don't often have when it comes to, development and aid and so on. Okay, so how a formalized ASM sector can assist with achieving a number of targets linked to the Sustainable Development Goals with special emphasis on Sub-Saharan Africa. And as I've indicated, where the donor agenda, fortunately, is set up in a way which in many cases, the formalization of ASM is the end goal. And these are examples of some interventions. The Africa Mining Vision, which is a sort of a development manifesto, extractives-led development manifesto for Africa. The Minimata Convention, many of you may or may not have heard of the Minimata Convention. This is a UN sort of initiative aimed at eradicating mercury from the system. Mercury is used to amalgamate gold, and when it methylates, it's pretty toxic. So this is sort of an intervention aimed at removing mercury from the system. And there's these governments Martin will get into this a bit more later, but these governments that sign up to this are required to put together a formalization, an action plan, which details a number of things, including how they intend to go about formalizing artisanal and small-scale gold mining. A number of donors across the board, as I've indicated, have funded work in the area of formalization, including here in Canada, Australia, the UK, and Germany. And what do I mean by formalization? I mean, when the donors talk about formalizing in this context, it's very legalistic in its definition, but we're talking about a process. It's not only about getting people licenses, it's about putting them in a position to access support services that they couldn't otherwise access sustainably over time, and being able to sort of educate them about various aspects of their operations and putting them in a position to mechanize and improve their efficiency. So it is a process, and obviously getting a license is a big part of that, because that gives you the security of tenure. You can't just go into a bank. If you go into a bank and don't have a legal operation, no one's going to give you a loan. So, it's putting yourself in a position, or putting people in a position to secure that elusive support. Now, as I've indicated, the case for formalizing ASM, there's a strong case when you look at the employment angle. There's, I mentioned 30 million people employed directly in this sector, and they're engaged in a wide range of different activities, producing different minerals that are very, very important for the market. In some of these countries, 90 to 100% of mining takes place on a small scale. A lot of these operations are engaged in the extraction of what we refer to as development minerals. Development minerals like sand and building materials that can be sourced locally and used for construction, or to feed into construction industries. I've shown you that table already. But there are a number of concerns in Africa, and you see this across the developing world, but it's particularly visible in Africa. There's a lot of competition for land between small-scale mining and large-scale mining. And this is, to a large extent, why most of the small-scale mining activities we see there are informal. Because if you take a look, and I'll get into this in a second, if you take a look at some of these lands, the entire country has been concessioned out to big mining companies, not just to mine, but to explore. And obviously that's significant, because the prospecting and the exploration basically determines or helps to pinpoint where those deposits are for mining. So there's a lot of concessions that have been awarded to these mineral exploration companies. This informality in the sector is associated with a number of negatives, okay? The environmental footprint being one, child labor being another, the way women are treated in the sector, safety, health and safety concerns. But my view is that we're focusing on these negatives too much, and it's linked to informality. So in theory, if we're able to formalize this sector and better support the sector, a lot of these problems would disappear. But there tends to be an overwhelming sort of focus on these negatives. And it's time that we start focusing on the positives. So when you're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, you're talking about the vast majority of these operations being informal, okay? And why? Why are they informal? There's a number of reasons why, and I'm going to identify some right now. The donors and governments, they simply hate artisanal and small-scale mining. They go out of their way to avoid this sector. It's crazy, okay? Here's the latest example, or one of the latest examples, all right? This is an atlas that was put together by Columbia University and the UNDP, and I was part of the sort of the consultation process, and we went back and forth 6-7 times about the importance of including artisanal and small-scale mining in this atlas. Now, this isn't specific to the SDGs in the sense that it isn't law or it isn't policy, but this atlas has gone a long way toward informing the dialogue. And in the end, they just decided to say, look, we really don't want to deal with this. We realized we didn't really include this sector in the Millennium Development Goals. We don't really want to include it in this atlas. It warrants a separate atlas, and yeah, it's important and it touches on all these SDGs, but we really don't want to deal with it in this atlas. It's a bit too messy for us. The same thing with poverty reduction strategy papers. There's been a visible sort of disappearance of ASM as sort of a focal area in successive poverty reduction strategy papers. And the New Economic Partnership for African Development, some of the sort of the regional, very, very seminal and landmark regional frameworks for development completely overlooked this sector, when again, it is by far the most important rural non-farm sector in Sub-Saharan Africa. In addition to simply disliking ASM, there's the obvious licensing fees and no land. I mentioned no land. I'll show you that in a minute. If you've concessioned out your country to large-scale mining companies, it becomes very difficult to get a license because there's no land. And in 70% or 80% of the cases that we see where there's conflicts between these miners, it's over access to land, because you cannot get a concession in an area that's already been concessioned out. And it makes sense, because if obviously in the most extreme of cases, if you have a shovel and a pick and rudimentary tools, you're obviously targeting very different deposits than to what the large-scale mining company is targeting. And in many cases, the large-scale mining company can't mine those deposits economically. So it becomes a case of the need to be proactive and to sort of cordon off these areas that contain these deposits, okay? And the whole complexity with getting a license, I mean, it's very, very complex. It's something that we've talked about for ages. The ILO mentioned this a long time ago in a landmark publication, and the same applies today. This was a time when the price of gold was about $280 an ounce, and now the price of gold is in the range of $1,300 an ounce, and the same problems still exist. So I don't know why we're creating these problems for ourselves. I mean, you look at this applies to everywhere I've worked and everywhere these guys have worked. You know, not only Ghana, but like Liberia, Sierra Leone. There's been a few instances where they've corrected this, but you know, I just don't understand why we're creating problems for ourselves. And it goes back to the donors, because the donors are giving these countries in Africa money to reform their mining sectors. So it's up to them to sort of provide that oversight. And this is a good example. I'm just giving an example from our research. A gentleman by the name of Festus, he was saying that, you know, there's not only these costs, ridiculous costs you have to pay to get a license, but there's sort of this, even if it isn't an informal economy purely, there's this sort of quasi-informal thinking around this, where you as a government have ignored the sector, and as a result, chiefs and all these other local level players are taking control of the space, and they're demanding that you pay them money when they're not even built into the legislation. And this is what he was referring to when he said, this is where the process officially starts. I have to do all this nonsense before I even am able to start processing my license. And here's some examples of countries. I mean, you just go on, you can retrieve this information online. I mean, there's a program called Flexicadastre, and you can see they update it every 3 or 4 hours. A number of African governments have this in place, and all their concessions data are online. And you can see from these countries like, you know, DRC and Zambia and Tanzania, the entire place is concessioned out. Where are you going to get a license if you're a small scale miner? It's virtually impossible. Some additional examples here, you know, in Ghana, you got about 25% of that land that's been under the control of these companies. Tanzania, where you get, you know, massive land that's been awarded as concessions. You know, like, and this is to show you the example of Liberia. You know, as of December 2007, it had approved 54 exploration licenses covering that amount of territory. I mean, this is something that's been going on. Put this into perspective, it's been going on for decades. It's not something that just started. This is a sort of a deeply rooted problem, okay? So it's very difficult to get a license, okay? Why is it difficult to get a license? Because, you know, the elephant in the room is rent seeking, all right? These governments are corrupt, okay? I can't say that at a UN conference. I've been sort of ushered out of UN conferences for saying that several times, but that's the elephant in the room. That's always the case. Why are they corrupt? Because they like money. And if you promote large-scale mining, you don't have to move to get that money. Companies come to you, they pay loads of money in exploration fees, rents, permits, and it's not just the mining royalties we're talking about the exploration companies. And you can just go on the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative websites for various countries, and they have all the reported revenue. And you can see, like, poor countries at the bottom of the Human Development Index are receiving boatloads of money that could be life-changing for the country if managed properly from large-scale mining, just by sort of not doing anything, just sitting on their seats and not having to do anything. This is another example from Burkina Faso, which is like dead bottom of the Human Development Index. So let me wrap up here, give these guys an opportunity to talk by asking the question, can we fix this? Where do we start? Okay, it's a huge problem. Okay, and there's not many people doing much creative thinking around this issue. Okay, I mean, you see some of them here. There's not, when I say there's not very many people looking at artisanal and small scale mining, there isn't. Okay, we're talking about 20 to 30 people in the world. Okay, so can we fix this? There's been some positive signs. Okay, I've done some work in Zambia, and this is what I refer to as the Zambia model. And why this is unique is most cases, these rent-seeking governments are just sitting down waiting for the World Bank to tell them what to do, okay? this is an example of a government that's taken the initiative and said, okay, look, let's try to formalize gold mining, okay? Let's see what we can do as institutions here. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. And that's what they did. They came up with all this they came up with this elaborate institutional framework where they were sort of delegating different responsibilities to different institutions. And this is their sort of formalization blueprint, okay? In response to gold rushes that surfaced only a few years ago. So the response time was quite quick. And this shows that, okay, you know, if Zambia can do it, a country which is fixated on copper revenue, it's the third or fourth biggest copper producer in the world, large-scale copper production. If they can do it, anyone can do it, okay? So there is some, you know, I'm always negative about this, and this has sort of given me some hope, all right? However, it does raise a lot of questions. Is this enough, you know, to combat what we refer to as the large-scale mining bias? These countries are fixated on large-scale mining, okay, because of the quick revenue they can get from it, all right? The Zambia model isn't gonna fix everything. It's a start, but it's not gonna fix everything. And in the case of the Zambia model, we're trying to replicate that elsewhere now. We have to remember that gold isn't a major mineral produced in Zambia. So maybe it's a case of, when you think a bit more deeply, maybe it's a case of, all right, the reason why they've been able to implement that model is no one really cares about the gold. But how would that work in a country like Tanzania, where there are a lot of players competing for gold, or Ghana, where there's a lot of people competing for gold on different scales, okay? Is this translatable into SDG terms? Because certainly mining, small scale mining, everyone gets the shakes, right? So we as academics, as thinkers, as policy people, as NGO people, we have to think a bit more creatively how we package our ideas, okay? In ways which speak to the SDG framework, right? How do we do it? Well, we're working on it, but a number of entry points, I think. I mean, all of these, the good thing is that even though the SDGs have, during the design phase, virtually ignored this sector, there are a number of different themes core themes that underpin the goals that a formalized ASM sector speaks to. Things like gender, food security. If we are able to sort of elaborate on that agric ASM link, then, you know, food security is a huge issue. Resilience. Resilience is the flavor of the month, right? How do you build resilience in these communities? Well, you support the activities that they're engaging in. You support activities across the livelihoods portfolio, okay? We're trying to get more data on this sector, right? We've launched this initiative through the World Bank, and I'm on the committee, the executive committee of this initiative, which aims to share data on this sector, because a lot of people assume that these people are simply rogue entrepreneurs trying to get rich, when in most cases it is a livelihood activity. We're trying to mobilize some of the jewelers and get them thinking about the SDGs and to purchase. We see this with coffee. I mean, there's a lot of criticism around fair trade, but in theory, fair trade is in theory about sourcing coffee from poor producers, which empowers them, and everyone's happy drinking their coffee because they've saved somebody, right? But that's what we're trying to do with minerals as well, and get the jewelers involved, and they're excited. And it all begins with the World Bank. You know, the World Bank is the biggest donor in the world, and they have a mining sector reform project in every country. There's fresh blood in the World Bank now in the mining division. So this is where sort of the thinking starts, and where we need to really fix and start sort of fixing some of these development interventions aimed at not only supporting ASM, but just mining in the extractive industries in general. So that's all I have to say. So we're gonna move quickly on to the next talk. Josh is going to talk to you about finance in ASM.
Okay, so while I'm looking at, my research looks at finance, it's quite closely, my talk's going to be quite closely aligned to what Gavin's covered today. He's looked quite broadly at the importance of formalization and giving a case for why it should be done and maybe how it could be done. And in my kind of research, when I've been looking at finance, a lot of it's been questioning actually what formality means, particularly on the ground. So I think this kind of links to certain ideas with the SDGs, and Gavin's covered that, so I won't go through it too much, just a brief overview. And I basically just come back from a year of field work in Malawi, so a lot of these ideas are relatively fresh in my mind, a bit muddled. So any kind of questions or any thoughts are, yeah, greatly appreciated, and I'll try and put things together. Is it? Oh, nice. So first of all, I'll look at financing the SDGs, how finance is linked to the SDGs, more as an enabler than a resolute goal in itself. Then moving on to, I guess, how we move from illegality into informality and formality and what that means. And then onto kind of this gap that I saw within that framework, something that I kind of consider the anti-social economy. Again, yeah, open to ideas on that. And then finally looking at what it means to be formal, what it means to be sustainable. And this is kind of like treading in and out of finance. I guess for me, a lot of these lessons were linked to what it means to be a formal financial provider, an informal provider. And then that kind of spreads out actually into what it means to be formal and informal, and what's kind of being missed within our current thinking. So. Nice. So financial inclusion, broadly, it's just about the use of, or access to, and the use of appropriate and accessible products, financial products and services. And importantly with that, it's not just about access, which is currently what gets brought up in a lot of policy. It's really about their use. There's no point having access to something if you're just never going to use it. And within this, it's more of an enabler and a means to an end rather than an end in itself. None of the SDGs explicitly say we need financial inclusion, but embedded within them, there's usually something, well, within these 8 in particular, there's clear links to access to financial services. And some of them might be a bit more clear cut, like reducing poverty, if you believe that financial inclusion can promote development or meaningful development. There's links to poverty. And this is something I guess you can just Google to see the links a bit more clearly and explicitly. So through financial services and products, there's just a range of tools, a range of accounts, and these offer different things from transactions, payments, credit, savings, insurance, the list goes on. I'm not going to bore you with these. And these tools have a range of uses, whether it's managing money, paying and receiving it, protecting your money, typically in forms of savings, providing information about how much money you have, where these different accounts are, and also offering a way to growth, like increasing your assets so that you can improve your current stock. And these are meant to lead to a string of benefits. I'm sure every one of us here kind of in some way benefits from having, well, in particular, digital financial services. I know now I've just got some like Monzo account and it's changed my life, just everything on my phone, super easy to track everything. But actually these benefits, while promising, they're a bit uncertain. No one really knows. And it's typically the trend of the day is the one that's most promising with the most benefits. And then somewhere down the line, it kind of peters out a bit. But it's these benefits, whether real or not, in different contexts, that feed into the SDGs. I think the important thing with the SDGs is how it's highlighted the social and environmental factors that we need to consider. And in particular, I think the social factors are really important for financial inclusion as well. We can't just look at financial inclusion to escape poverty. We also need to be considering social inclusion and kind of more deeply embedded root causes of poverty. And my research in particular, it was looking at social perceptions of finance and what that meant for engaging with, perceiving, and the impacts of finance on the ground in relation to ASM. So kind of this research started from the desk initially and then moved into the field. So I had some kind of preconceived ideas before I moved into doing this field work. And the importance of including social factors and importantly for me, social perceptions is that it's rooted in our understandings of small scale mining and also the informal economy at large. So this will be unpacked over the next few slides and we'll kind of step back and forth into finance throughout this and also kind of round it up by linking it to the SDGs at the end. So when we're looking at small scale mining, Gavin's covered quite a lot of, I guess, the descriptive side of what it means. But when you come down to these definitions, you kind of have one side of it, which is this operational objective means of looking at it. Its size, its scale, what it uses. And typically it comes down to it being something that's very low tech, low mechanization, and a very high labor intensity. Gavin talked about kind of pickaxes and shovels. It's kind of going back to the Americas in the 1800s is kind of, or some of you might have seen the film Blood Diamonds. I'm not saying that it's like that in real life, but the actual kind of brute force needed on the ground is often something similar. And you might get a feel for these in the pictures as well. And then there's some caveats that get added, more the individual and subjective side of things, just to add some richness to actually understand what's going on the ground. And one of that is that it's typically poverty driven. Although not across the board, poverty is a big factor, kind of opening up to the motivations of why people engage, and also what it's like to be on the ground. Often these activities are in poorer, more rural areas. And another thing that comes with that is also this informality. Much of the economies that these activities are taking place in are informal in themselves, but small scale mining in particular is, in its nature, is very informal. And it's what this means to be informal that I'm kind of interested in me quite a lot before going on the field work, and even more when I was on the ground. And while informality as a term has tried to be used to separate these activities from illegality, it kind of still comes across as the same thing a lot of the time in discussions, especially in policy and research. It's just kind of illegality with a bit of a smoother edge a lot of the time, even though it kind of can be something quite different. And it's like Gavin said, he was linking a lot of the issues in small scale mining to informality in itself. And these connotations have been hard to extract. So I'll be looking at how you can unpack informality and kind of potential challenges that that has for formalization. So I'm looking a bit more deeply at, I'm not here to argue whether formalization is kind of good or bad. There's like one part of me that's a pragmatic business student that's all for formalization. The other half is, it's like Jekyll and Hyde, is a critical geographer that's a bit structuralist and wants nothing to do with it, but it's happening in donor spaces, in policy. That's where the sector is going. And this is kind of just bringing up maybe something that's missing from these discussions. So our current definitions of formality bridge these discourses of legality and legitimacy. And there's these two narratives. One comes from the top, from these laws and regulation, and one kind of comes more from the bottom, from society, from different social groups, and at many different scales. And typically, informality has come to, on the ground represent a discourse of legitimacy, illegitimacy, while at the top in these donor spaces, it's more talking about legality, illegality, and what that means. And informality has come to kind of meet at the convergence of this, somewhere where you're outside of the required regulations, outside of the licenses and permits required by law, but actually you have this social license to operate. There's some legitimacy on the ground. And this social license to operate has kind of been recognized for quite a long time as being important in large scale mining, having a range of costs and negatives that can be associated by operating illegitimately. But in small scale mining, this has only recently kind of been pushed in as something that's important, to unpack informality to something that's just completely illegal, something that might be criminal. And so for me, this mirrored a conceptual framework from the informal entrepreneurship literature, looking at, how legality and legitimacy link and what this means for unpacking informality. And on one side, you have formal institutions, typically from the top, that confer this legality through laws and regulations. So you might have like the government or the judiciary that push these into society. And then you have, on the other hand, informal institutions that are looking at legitimacy. And this comes more from the top, from the bottom, looking at societal norms, their values and beliefs. And these typically come from more like social, cultural entities. And they change over time and are much more disparate and spatially kind of incongruent. It can be in one household next to another. These kind of social norms can be very different. Things like religion and culture make a big difference. But there are kind of similarities that we can flesh out from this. And so while this research, it came from neo-institutional economics, which I know has got a lot of flaws in it, it doesn't really look at power relations at all. It's just the kind of narrative that I'm seeing in these donor spaces, very economically driven. And it's this mirroring of approach, which I thought was important. And so how this fleshes out the more I guess initially small-scale mining was viewed as inherently negative, just across the board, illegal, illegitimate, and this was the kind of the narrative coming out 20 years ago. But as it's kind of moved away from this inherent negativity, this is where the informal has stemmed from it. So this is termed as the renegade economy, something that's illegal, illegitimate, something that's illegal but legitimate gets drawn into the informal. So renegade economy might be something that uses slave labor. I think most people would agree that slave labor is completely socially unacceptable, and that any activities using it is going to be illegitimate. And with that illegitimacy, there becomes greater burdens that you have to face, especially when you're doing these activities or engaging within this space, whether it comes from communities you're engaging with, but also state actors as well. And it's when we touch on formality that I kind of had this issue that came out, and where I think these like serious shortcomings arise, is that, and this is not just in ASM, but in kind of wider thought, is that this conception of legitimacy just falls away when we start talking about formality. There's this kind of formality is put on this podium. As soon as you've gone through these laws and regulations and processes, you're good, you're formal. And this, yeah, it's just this complete abandonment, it feels to me, of any type of legitimacy and its importance. And actually what you kind of have is that there's this assumption that just because you're legal, you are legitimate. Actually, when I was kind of sitting at the desk, I was just thinking there's so many of these large-scale mining companies that are acting in atrocious ways. They're clearly not legitimate, and that comes with a face of, yeah, a huge string of costs. And there's all these narratives coming around about how these companies are destroying the environment or harming their workers, in conflict with communities. I thought it was important that actually moving into this work to unpack this, considering a category where legality doesn't mean legitimacy. And from that came, don't want to say I'm coining it, I'm sure somewhere in some journal this has already been brought up, but it kind of frames for me something like the antisocial economy, something that's, in many senses, it might look formal, but actually it's causing harm. It's not legitimate. And it's typically when you have these socially unacceptable practices that, yeah, society will turn against these activities, and that comes with a string of consequences. And while I'd seen this more in large-scale companies, and there's CSR as a strategy to move, I guess, away from illegitimacy to try and gain legitimacy on the ground, and there's marketing strategies, PR strategies that companies use, there's still, yeah, I'm sure you could read any paper any day and you'd probably find the mining company doing something wrong somewhere. And it is a messy industry, both at the small scale and at the large scale. It's very hard to get right. That doesn't mean we can't disregard that there are these issues. And they come with substantial costs or can even shut down the operations. And so how this linked to finance was, so I was on field work until the end of August this year, from last September. And I was kind of looking at the social perceptions and motivations for engaging with the small scale mining sector and also engaging with finance. And what I was finding on the ground was that different people perceive these financiers in different ways. And actually many of the things that we'd perceive as legitimate, potentially in Canada, in the UK, in the West, maybe just, it's going to be completely contextual, actually on the ground were perceived in different ways from a lot of actors. And so in this, I talked to, miners, diggers, sponsors, buyers, traditional leaders, government officials, stakeholders in the private sector, NGOs, civil society, and donors. And these perceptions of illegitimacy were kind of pervasive against formal companies and actors, as well as the informal actors as well. And at the bottom, you had people who were illegal and illegitimate, these money lenders, maybe loan sharks on the ground, Caterpillar as they're called in Malawi. And then also the mineral dealers that were there. And while in wider ASM literature, these dealers are now seen as potentially more symbiotic rather than parasitic, in Malawi it was the opposite. So I went there expecting there to be kind of this interesting area to look into where these dealers were working with these miners in a constructive way, because that's where the literature was heading and that's where the policy is kind of heading. But actually in Malawi, it was the complete opposite. Everyone considered them as crooks. So you have these countering narratives, and it just shows how contextual it is, where in Malawi, might be surrounded by Zambia, Mozambique, Tanzania, in all these countries, these narratives coming out about symbiotic relationships are completely the opposite. And then you have the family and friends, savings banks, rural savings banks that might be considered legitimate but are illegal. And then the traditional banks that you get on the high streets or in more urban centres and microfinance, depending on the actor, would be viewed typically quite negatively, or actually sometimes positively, but people would just know that they couldn't access them. And actually it was in particular microfinance, something that's been proposed as something that's really important for moving along with SDGs and kind of pushing financial services, was probably the most frowned upon financial service that there was. And it was just seen as a way to get yourself involved in debt bondage, to be exploited, to be handed contracts that you just didn't understand the consequences of. Ooh. Sorry. I think as part of this, one of the key things was that as the scale of the operation increased, so moving from finance back to the miners themselves, as the scale of operation increased, societal expectations changed as well, and that caused kind of issues for legitimacy. So while you might have a very small scale mine on the ground that has to meet almost no social burdens, as soon as it started formalizing, as soon as it started increasing in size, mechanizing, the burden that was placed on it by the communities actually became quite large and was disincentivizing formalization in some ways, because people realized that as soon as they started getting, say, for example, in extreme cases, moving towards medium scale, maybe getting diggers, using explosives, people would then reflect on the experiences of other communities, large scale mines in particular, where they'd been offering schools, maybe a borehole, other different public services. And then the community would start expecting that to be delivered by miners, even though they were working on a small scale. So there's this like issue of legitimacy as well that comes along with formalization, where actually the burden as we move through formality, it might increase. So just because someone's small scale to begin with, and they have almost no social burden because they're kind of embedded within that community, as they start to formalize, they need to be, well, I think we need to be aware that there could be more pressures just than the ones faced from laws and regulations alone. And that's going to have an impact on them. And particularly, as you were saying, like there's this whole string of needs that need to be met by offering payment typically to traditional authorities. That makes a huge difference. And especially in countries where, you've given the case of Ghana, where these traditional authorities have come to almost commandeer this space, although they were part of it before these laws were imposed. This can form a much bigger factor than the laws themselves. They're the ones with the power on the ground to kind of change things, to actually act when these mining operations, act in ways that communities aren't happy with. So I think just to round up, keep pressing the wrong buttons. What this means for sustainability is just, I think most importantly is how we engage with the formal and the informal, or whether how informal and informal actors engage with development and what that means on the ground. Just because something is formal doesn't mean that it is going to be legitimate. And it's particularly in finance, there's so many narratives now coming out about microfinance being potentially exploitative. And there's also a lot of narratives coming out about the informal sector in themselves being just as exploitative, but it's a spectrum. It's not based on, I don't know, a typology of who these people are, whether they're in the informal or formal sector. It's more on how they act on the ground. And what does it mean to have sustainable formalization? So I guess this is adding on to kind of what Gavin was talking about. And for me, I think there just needs to be a separation of legality and legitimacy. We can't just assume that just because something is legal, it's doing the right thing for those communities on the ground. And that actually there's a need to move out from this. And while in large scale mining, they've kind of recognized this through CSR and a lot of like different other practices that they try and implement on the ground, whether that's good or bad. Again, I'm happy to discuss that. What this separation means is just you have to keep society central, no matter what scale it is. And I'm worried that in this transition phase from the small scale up towards slightly larger scales, that might be lost because so much of the focus is on law, is on regulation. And I think that's correct because at the moment, so much of what's going on in the ground, it has to focus on the community on these informal institutions and meeting their needs, but you can't just ignore them as we scale up. And while at the large scale, yeah, that's kind of been absorbed in as we transition, something to, yeah, bear in mind, both for financial actors, any actor within this sector, and also maybe the wider informal economy as a whole. And yeah, I've kind of already mentioned this. It has implications not just for small scale, but also for the large scale. And it's going to be this spectrum, and it's going to change within this spectrum. And I'll probably just leave it there for now. So hopefully it kind of made relative sense.
Yes, my name is Cynthia Kumah, and I am a PhD student at Carleton University. Today's paper research is actually about a woman's world, elitism and marginalization among female small-scale miners in Sub-Saharan Africa. The purpose of this research is actually linked on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Goal 5, which is more or less about gender equality. And gender equality seeks to empower women and girls, providing them with equal access to education, healthcare, decent job, for them to achieve a proper representation in political and economic decision-making to force sustainable economic and benefits to society and humanities. This research is actually ongoing. I had the opportunity to interact with a couple of women way back in Ghana, and that was where my interest built in artisanal small-scale mining, because from speaking with them, I realized the impact on gold on their lives, how they are affected by mercury, their livelihoods, if there's any alternative livelihoods for them. So I built my interest in that, and well, I came to Canada, Carleton, and I decided to go through the same process with my PhD to understand the background, the circumstances driving these women to mine, the roles they play in the sector, what impacts this work has on their livelihoods. I also wanted to understand the policy context. To what extent does policy capture the realities of mercury? Because back home, these women are exposed to mercury, and well, when you speak with them, most of them are not even aware about the health implications it has on their lives. So, I mean, this is a platform to understand more and understand the pathways to their exposure. I also want to acquire knowledge to map the organizational structures of ASM and flows of mercury, like I said, and also want to listen to them. Probably, well, in the end, we may be able to help them come out of all these. From this research, we were able to raise up a couple of questions, and these are the questions. What are the gender-related concerns in ASM in Sub-Saharan Africa related to the SDGs 5, that is gender equality? What are the environmental implications of women's work? What are the social implications of women's work? Are there elites? So this is what this paper is actually about. We want to find out if there are elites in the sector, and well, if they are doing something to help this marginalized group of people. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about the background of these women, how they've been exposed to mercury, their awareness to mercury, what can be done about them, and the elite women. Then I'll just conclude. Gavin and Josh has already spoken at length about what ASM actually is about, the informalities, the illegalities of the sector. And well, back home, from my research, I realized that this sector is sort of informal because of the fact that regulations are not streamlined. The inspectors do not want to ensure that work is done, one, and then, well, there's little incentives for these miners to work with. And then the big problem, which is the licensing, because back home, getting a license is very difficult. If you don't have to, I mean, you have to bribe these people to be able to get a land, first of all, and then get permission to even mine. So it's really a problem. And these miners wouldn't want to do that. So they would want to be informal. And that is where all the problems come in. From my research, we spoke to these women. We wanted to know why they would still want to mine, especially when there's all these health risk in the job they do. And of course, they said it was lucrative. Most people are not getting enough money from what they do, and there's not an alternative livelihood. So, I mean, what they want to do is to mine because it's easy to mine, you get quick money, and so, well, because they are driven by poverty, they go into these mining. These are some of the quotes from the previous research I did. Well, I'll just read the first one. This is a woman I interviewed from Eastern region. She goes like, it is a good job, like I said earlier. How would I have been able to pay my loan if I had not mined? Judging from all these people I take care of, I cannot just sit idle and not work. I need to use my hand very hard to take care of my 6 children and the others that have been placed under my care. And this is basically the kind of things you hear from these women. It's either they have to pay school fees, hospital bills. I mean, they just have to survive. So that is why they go into these mining activities. The second issue we have uncovered a lot on this data is about mercury, and I'll leave that for Martin. He's the mercury expert, so he will go deep into that. So this research also wanted to know the extent to which these women are aware of mercury, how they've been exposed. Is there anything we can do to help them whilst they work? And then this is where my work is now. I haven't really dived into this much, but from WhatsApp conversations and other interviews I've had with some of these women, I realized that, okay, there's this hierarchy of women. Some are marginalized. Well, there's a supposed elite group, and these women actually attend these conferences and they have the knowledge. But my point is, as information sent through to these women who are actually affected by this mercury pollution. So this is where my work actually is. And I had this conversation with one elite miner. Okay, so a question I asked was, do you have a representative organization for women ASM miners in Ghana, and how does the managerial structure work within? Well, from all the conversation, it looked like, well, okay, well, yeah, these women, we care about them, yes, of course, but we are not able to send information to them because probably they are not aware. And if they are able to attend conferences that we attend, then that's where they get the information. But what happens if they don't even hear about these conferences about mercury pollution and all that? So I realized that, okay, there's actually the elitism problem, which we have to tackle. On my conclusion, well, I'm very excited about my project because I'm always happy to work with these women. I mean, where I come from, if you have the chance to speak to them and you see how they manipulate their work, you can tell that they want to make a living out of it. So what I want to do actually is to be able to get more information, go back to my country and help these women. And also because I'm very privileged to be part of this, well, group of women who are more like elites, like women in mining back home, they have the chance, they have the platform to speak to these policy makers. So, well, I just want to be able to help these women, especially in the terms of, in the pathway of mercury, their exposure to mercury, what I can just do to help them. Yes, so that is where my project is. Thank you. I'll leave it for Martin to take us through the mercury pollution.
Okay, our final talk will be given by Martin Clifford from the University of Delaware, and that will take us into probably lunch. And well, if you have any questions for us, we're happy to hang around. So,
Hi, thanks everyone. So I'll try and whistle through this so that we're not running too late and we might have time for a couple of questions. So I'm going to be looking at the environmental dynamics of ASM as they relate to the SDGs. We've covered, Gavin's maybe indicated a little bit about some of the environmental impacts, and we've had a discussion about some of the sort of social, economic, cultural dynamics that have been going on. But in terms of environmental aspects of ASM is the hardest sell, I would suggest. The sector is just completely synonymous with environmental destruction. If you know anything about artisanal mining, you've probably heard about it going on in the Amazon basin, in the DRC. It's a messy, socially messy, environmentally messy business. We're talking about deforestation. We're talking about subsequent desertification, sterilization of land. It often digs up a lot of heavy metal elements, which means that even after mining has been exhausted, plants can't be regrown in the soil. You need to just look at some of these images to get an idea of the scale of destruction. In terms of extracting gold, and as Cynthia's mentioned, which is a prevalent problem in Ghana, we have the use of elemental mercury to extract gold. And increasingly, we also have the use of cyanide leaching. We probably don't need much more information about how potentially horrible cyanide is for the environment. And it's important to note as well, something that's in stark contrast to the large-scale mining sector, and again, linked to informality, there's just zero remediation of these sites. You'll find sort of old mine shafts, huge pits filled with stagnant water, again, for sort of environmental health, malaria risk, things like that. It's a big problem. If we think about how these link to the SDGs, then it hits several of them. I would suggest certainly things like good health and well-being. If you're living near a mining site, it's not going to be particularly good for you. Clean water and sanitation. We have release of mining waste, tailings into local rivers, clogs it up, kills fish, reduces oxygen content, etc. The destruction obviously also affects life below water and above land. And in line with that as well, if we think about how these minerals are being extracted, minerals that often ultimately find our way into our jewelry, into our consumer items, then we also need to think about the responsible consumption production of precious industrial metals and minerals. So just to give a couple of examples of how this actually comes into place. So if we think about deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals, research that's taken place over 30, 40 years have just repeatedly associated ASM worldwide with just a plethora of health impacts. Talking about mercury intoxication, we're talking about respiratory illnesses, we're talking about malnutrition, we're talking about communicable diseases, malaria, HIV, things like this. Not only in mining communities themselves, but often quite far downstream, people who aren't directly affected in mining. And the same goes for the impacts that has on clean water and sanitation. As I mentioned, responsible consumption, that's not just miners themselves, but also who they're mining the minerals for. And we have the kind of, destruction of virgin forest. We have encroachment of miners onto conservation areas. Huge amounts of that going on in, places like Guyana, Brazil, again, the Amazon basin, also forest reserves in places like Ghana and DRC. So if we think about mining itself and how it relates to more sustainable development, mining itself, of course, is ultimately inherently unsustainable, right? You're taking a finite, non-renewable resource from the earth. And we could say that artisanal mining, because there's no remediation, because there's little in the way of regulation, because there's little in the way of safety practice, it's the most environmentally damaging form of mining. And unavoidably, that is due to the fact that it's unregulated. You know, they can't be assisted. Governments won't assist illegal miners. And most of these people are operating on a hand-to-mouth basis. You can only begin to remediate, to plan, to build, if you have some sort of stock of logistical, financial resources behind you to do that. Therefore, we can't really expect anything from the artisanal sector as it is at the moment in terms of reclamation, environmental safeguards. So some of the key questions that we might want to ask on an environmental tangent in terms of ASM towards the SDGs is, we can't avoid environmental impacts of mining. How can we avoid the worst impacts of environmental mining? And what social and economic conditions do we have to establish within mining communities for that to happen? And how do we make that happen through policy-making decisions, through assistance, through aid, through donor decision-making? As Gavin's indicated, despite its sort of very significant contributions to GDP, to exports, to livelihoods, to downstream businesses, mining actually receives relatively short shrift within the SDGs. For example, in 2019, voluntary national reviews of Sub-Saharan African countries with sizable ASM activities, it's virtually non-existent, in fact, in terms of important industries to target for making more sustainable. So really one of the fundamental questions is, can we have a more environmentally sound artisanal mining sector? There's a few options here. First two, you know, will be crossed out. We can leave it in the ground. We can't really. We can halt mining. We can't really do that either. Certain countries who have tried this, Peru, Ghana, most recently, it doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because there's a very, very compelling reason why people are doing this in the first place. It's the social, economic situations behind this. We can remediate exhausted ASM sites, and that's something that's sort of developing. There's low-cost budget ways to do that. If you're of a, if you're of a sort of ecological bent, there actually are some quite interesting ways in which it can be done in a low-budget sense. But the best way which we can ensure sounder environmental practice is by formulating, regulating, and importantly, assisting artisanal miners. Informality in an environmental sense, it prevents an environmental accountability, not just on terms of the miners, but also on terms of the authorities. So if we begin to bring them in to a more regulated way of working, I put here that if you have a greater sense of entitlement, you're getting more, you're more supported, you also have a greater level of responsibility environmentally. And the Minamata Convention on Mercury, sorry, we haven't got much more to go from this. So this represents the latest push towards formalizing the small-scale mining sector. Mercury is the stimulus for it, but it certainly touches on many key areas within the sector. And we can actually see this. Sorry if that writing is quite small. I think the slides, are the slides shared? I don't know. But we can see that as well as what I had suggested, it's also hitting things like poverty, decent work. It does hit those things in a kind of socio-environmental sense. The way in which the Minamata Convention is supposed to be initialized or implemented, sorry, should I say, is through these national action plans that each country has to come up with. And just in terms of the kind of policy-making landscape, and this ties back into what Gavin sort of said at the beginning. Largely, there's been a concentration within research and initial conversations about implementing national action plans. There's been a concentration on doing the things that are more kind of stark or black and white. As Gavin has indicated, people don't really want to deal with the messiness of the sector. So we've had a concentration on legal frameworks for formalization, for example. We've had an idea of maybe trade strategies for reducing mercury trade worldwide. How do the miners get it? How is it coming in? Are we banning it somewhere? Baseline estimates. This has been going on for decades, really. How much mercury is being released worldwide on a regional scale, and strategies for mercury-free gold mining. So we take a bit of technology down to the guys, you know. The messier stuff and the stuff which, as I hope we've maybe indicated in this panel, will probably be critical to making sure that ASM can contribute as far as it can do towards more sustainable development here, is going to be information to ASM communities, sensitization, education, public health strategies. And these are the things that really have just not been given any attention so far in these kind of embryonic national action plans. And just to wrap things up, this runs the risk of history repeating itself, certainly in terms of mercury intervention or even technological intervention, improving mining practice here. That is that we're attempting to do this from a rather technocratic point of view without being cognizant of the end target audience and what's driving the sector, what's underpinning the sector. So I would suggest that at the moment we run the risk of doing the same thing. We're prioritizing hard, technocratic, bureaucratic, legislative tools over the softer approaches, the need for ongoing, gradual, people-centered approaches to these environmental problems that really actually have a social underpinning to them. So I think that, just to summarize, I think that in the environmental sort of parts of ASM towards the SDGs, we're doing rather perhaps the same thing as we're doing with some of the sociological things. So we're focusing on mitigating negative impacts rather than nurturing and encouraging sort of more positive impacts within the sector. Thank you very much. That's me done. If anyone has any questions or queries, then please speak to us now or whilst we're eating lunch. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, if you guys have any questions, we're here, and we can talk about small-scale mining forever.
Asking which key actors are responsible or held accountable for moving towards a more legitimate and legal operation?
Do you want me to answer? Yeah. None. Who should be held accountable? The governments. And who should be spearheading this process? The governments. It's a really difficult issue to broach because of the nature of these institutions and the large-scale mining bias and the fixation on large-scale mining, and the fact that you can't really broach these issues in a donor space because they claim the response you'll get is that we have to look apolitical. We can't look like we're telling a government what to do, when ironically, based on the conditions attached to a loan you give to a country, you're in effect telling the country what they can and cannot do. But you know, we're of the view that when a country gets a funding package to support mining, and you can't really, a different approach needs to be taken in a country like Ghana, and a country like Mali, and a country like Tanzania, which are considered mature mining sector reformers. But in a country like, say, Malawi, or a country like maybe Mozambique, or a country like Liberia, you can start the thinking about small-scale mining right now. And the way you do that is you ensure that all the measures, because it's not a case of there not being money. The World Bank gives money to do all these activities, is how they're executed. So what a government will do is take the money, and then it'll basically say, all right, well, let's bring in all the large-scale mining companies. We'll lower our taxes, whatever, attract them. and they'll chop that money, and then there'll be no land to formalize small-scale mining. So our view is that if that thinking takes place early on in the process, both can coexist simultaneously. Now, the question becomes, how do you get a government to think about that? And what we've looked at is the issue of taxation. A government is not going to, you know, despite what they say at international conferences, a government is not going to jump it's not going to respond in the way you want them to respond. If you say, you know what, if you formalize this sector, if you put the effort in now, hundreds of thousands of people are going to benefit. No, because generally speaking, those officials are looking out for themselves, right? So you have to start talking about the taxation issue early on. And if you can demonstrate that there's revenue to be gained that doesn't, in a way that doesn't upset them from or prevent them from getting the revenue from the large scale mining sector, then they'll jump on board in the end because it's revenue. Unfortunately, that's the game you have to play. But in terms of who should be accountable, it's definitely the donors, and it's definitely the governments, and it's definitely the miners, you know, everyone. Because as Cynthia's work and all of their work has shown, I mean, there is a lot of elite capture in this space, and they're probably worse than the government, some of these elite miners. So.
Is this on? Yeah, it is. Well, so I think another emerging thing which will be interesting to watch will be how much teeth the Minamata Convention has as well. Each country that does have more than an insignificant amount of artisanal mining activity, and pretty much every country worldwide signed this thing. It's legally binding. They have to produce one of these action plans. A lot of people are dragging their feet on this, but when they are produced, it will be interesting to see how particular they are, how strong they are, and whether they're going to be accountable for actually fulfilling them. But that I would suggest that that's maybe the next big timeline to watch in regards to this. Yeah.
Oh, Josh,
just quickly. I guess I'd also like caution against, or maybe take it from the view of maybe the people that are instigating these policies. And a lot of this is coming from the top down. So I guess for the government, what I was hearing on the ground is a lot of formalization is a box ticking exercise because it brings money in. And it's a way to offer elite capture. And for the miners as well on the ground, often it is just a box ticking exercise. I think there's probably a need for people to experience the benefits of what the sector can offer. And there are cases in certain countries where there are clear benefits, but in a lot of cases, it's just rhetoric. And I think people, I don't know whether maybe you have ideas about this on the Minamata stuff, whether you'd have any concerns about that also for these countries, just seeing this is another box ticking exercise for us. We've been told to do this, but actually I wonder how many of these countries are really on board for it. And while in spirit, there might be a few members of the government that might be, I'm sure that across the board, a lot of people are fed up with being told what to do, especially if they aren't really seeing any benefit on the ground, or if their incentives are misaligned, which is when I guess corruption and stuff also comes in. So it's really difficult. You have these supposed incentives and you're told about these incentives on the ground, but if they don't exist or if they aren't seen, it becomes very difficult to make anyone, it's hard to hold people accountable to it. You need people to actually champion it. And I think that's why Gavin's doing a good job, because he does champion it. Whereas for a lot of other people, they're just kind of, I think, imposing a bit more. Yeah.
Just one quick point too. I mean, man, I'm never going to finish this book, but I'm supposed to be writing a book. It's due in May 2008. But anyway, we have to look at the flip side here, and that's the fact that this economy is deeply entrenched, and there are a lot of people. We're looking at it idealistically here to some extent. There are a lot of different actors who we haven't even mapped that are benefiting from this sector being informal, and that's the chiefs. It's not, if you implement a licensing system that's user friendly, it's not going to change things overnight. So, yeah. Question.
I had
Oh, that's okay. We have all day.
Yeah, a couple of them were sort of for Joshua's work. Who did you consider sort of the audience for your PhD, and did you have an overall objective of your work? So, as a PhD supervisor, I'll ask this question.
Yeah, so for me, I went into the sector so in my master's, I went and did some field work in Ghana. And there I kind of was exposed to this counter narrative of reading the literature of these financiers who are supporting the sector on the ground, like local money lenders or dealers who typically provide like trader finance. And usually the conditions of that is mineral supply. So they'll provide the money, kind of like angel investor kind of thing, and then they'll get the mineral supply back and they'll take a cut out of that. And so I was countered with this narrative of, well, in the research and in policy space, that these people were exploitative, very parasitic on the sector, and then on the ground was exposed to something, well, more of an experience where the banks were viewed as very parasitic and these money lenders were viewed quite favorably. So that was the frame of reference I went moving into my PhD, is trying to look at actually different social perceptions surrounding finance. But for me, there's just a lot of gripes around what I was seeing in formality. And I think I'm the worst devil's advocate against myself. And I'm sure Gavin knows this. I'm just like a plethora of questions. And yeah, being exposed more recently to like critical geographers definitely hasn't helped that. But it's also made me appreciate that you need to be pragmatic in some ways. And so, yeah, the audience, it would be, I don't really know who I'm targeting at the moment because I don't think I can really provide answers. Like, if I'm perfectly honest, coming back, all I know right now is that I know very, very little. And that from reading lots of narratives from lots of different countries, it's so contextual. And so initially I thought the audience would be, yeah, a lot of different stakeholders. It would be miners, it would be donors, academia. And now I'm kind of just trying to focus on myself at the moment, just trying to work out actually like how I'm going to frame this without selling the miners and the people on the ground short by putting it into a narrative that doesn't actually reflect what I saw them as thinking and like feeling. Because I went there with a very like Western ethic, and on the ground it's not like that at all. The logic and rationality is so different. So I'm kind of, yeah, balancing that at the moment. It's like, who is my audience? And maybe I can choose multiple different audiences. I can write the PhD and the audience is academia. I can write maybe an executive summary and the audience is then going to be one for donors and policymakers. And then hopefully also one that speaks to miners. But to talk to those audiences, you need to talk in very, very different ways. I think ultimately, to all audiences, it would be that, yeah, it's much more complicated than it looks and you can't take things for granted. But that's only because that's what I'm learning and what I learn along this process. But I don't know how to put that into a constructive way, because especially once you get to decision-making levels, you need answers, but I'm super uncomfortable offering any because it is so rich and you've got to kind of lay a blueprint down at some point. But part of me just wants to, yeah, focus on saying that actually it can't be very rigid. It really needs to be a bit more contextual and a bit more loose. So yeah, the audience at the moment there's probably maybe 3 or 4 different pieces that need to come out just because the languages are so different. And that's daunting.
I think what he's getting at is he's trying to appeal to an audience of philosophers. I think that's what he's getting at.
Thank you. That was helpful. And I'll just ask one other question. I assume there are a lot of conflicts between the large and small scale mining operations, which I sort of heard alluded to in the different presentations with respect to land. But are there very many conflicts with respect to the workforce and things like that, or are the large scale much more using mechanical systems?
Do you mean conflicts between different artisanal mining groups, for example, or do you mean between?
Or between the large scale and the small scale, but amongst just conflicts within the sector, but also.
Certainly in terms, sorry, do you mind?
Go ahead, go ahead.
So certainly in terms of large and small, yes, it has been kind of repeated worldwide. I mean, you've probably heard in various instances from Peru, for example, Colombia. Ghana happens a lot as well, as Gavin indicated in his talk. Huge concessions have been given out. Very little of them are actually worked. And they are targeting different deposits. If you've got a sort of small pocket of gold near the surface, it doesn't make economic sense to dig it out. You know, you're not going to set up all your equipment and blah, 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 blah. So until recently, and probably by and large, the companies kind of defend their concessions relatively rigidly. But there's plenty of places in Ghana where everything is being brought from Anglo Gold Ashanti or Barrick or, you know, Newmont's concessions into town to be processed. Usually it's kind of skirmishes between security guards and you know, mining groups. I don't think in Ghana, in Sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't usually escalate into sort of violence. Maybe Gavin might have a bit more to say about that. In terms of between different ASM groups, the very interesting dynamic across a lot of Africa has been the migration and emergence of Chinese-operated mines within you know, what would traditionally be local communities. Large amounts of that going on in Ghana and probably elsewhere that you've been to as well. You might want to say a bit more about that, Gav.
Yeah, well, I mean, if there's anything good that's come out of being a sort of a square peg in a round hole, a development studies guy being based in a business school, which is a bit surreal, but has been the fact that I've been forced to look at different business frameworks. And this has led me to sort of look more in depth, I guess, you know, to an extent that I wouldn't have otherwise, at the sort of the anatomy of the multinational corporation. And what people don't realize with sort of CSR exercises in the mining sector is it's just the assessments we see in the literature are basically snapshots in time, you know, so they don't take into account the fact that the mining sector is a life cycle. And if you're looking at, in particular being here in Canada, where 75% of the mining companies are listed on the Vancouver and Toronto stock exchanges, I mean, these properties change hands like every day. And you know, I remember being in Ghana about 15 years ago. And one of the guys was speaking in the local language. He was referring to this company as Pioneer. And I kept saying, you know, what is this guy talking about? That the company's a pioneer? It turned out that was 7 owners ago. He was referring to the owner of that mine. And with each owner comes a different managerial strategy. And what people also don't understand is that mining company could be a subsidiary of another mining company. And so all that has an impact on what goes on the ground. And what you see in some of these countries, particularly Africa, is you have a very accommodating strategy towards small scale mining, for example. And then all of a sudden, some owner comes in and that changes overnight. And it sort of feeds into arguments about the social license to operate and, you know, how that applies in Sub-Saharan Africa and so on. But we have this thing in business, I'm trying to get my head around it, about stakeholder salience and legitimacy theory. And, you know, I remember being in Ghana a couple of years ago, we did this project and Goldfields sponsored this small scale mining workshop. And I said, the objective of this workshop, I went up and the guy who was working for Goldfields was at the back of the room. I said, the objective of this workshop on formalizing small scale mining is to ensure that that guy is never in the room again. And he nodded, because what this process has done, giving up big land and parcel land to large-scale miners without any thought behind it, is it's made small-scale mining a stakeholder, a significant stakeholder. And it shouldn't be, because if we're able to sort of delineate and to identify the different deposits, all these conflicts would be prevented. And the situation is this: every one of those mining sector reform projects puts aside money to do this. So it's that whole sort of governance of that project where things go wrong, because the World Bank obviously has to pass the money on to somebody, and it can only sort of do things up to a certain point. A second point quickly is the gold price. Now, a lot of people are saying, the World Bank, the ICMM, and a lot of industry organizations are saying, oh, these mining companies should partner with small-scale miners. Who in their right mind wants to do that? Nobody. And they're drawing on examples from, you know, the early 2000s when the gold price was $300 an ounce. And of course, mining companies weren't mining then because it wasn't profitable, but they're holding on to their concessions. And sure, they're allowing people to mine because it was a cheap way of sort of conducting geological assessments. Where are those guys going? Ah, okay, we'll remember that when the gold price goes up. So, you know, these are the two things that we're looking at, and we're in the process of revising a paper, which not to sort of, you know, to self-promote, but I mean, we're in the process of revising a paper which talks about these issues in depth, these relations. So.
And often it isn't, because you talked about, the question was about conflict, and often from what I saw, it isn't like direct conflict that's one of the biggest issues that you see. It's just the tension that can get created with these activities, whether it's encroaching on large scale operations. Also, it can often just be like the illegal divide, where, yeah, you have these people buying up these concessions, and that doesn't just happen on a large scale. Lots in Malawi, it's just hundreds and hundreds of small scale concessions have been bought up that small scale miners were already working on. And that in itself just kind of starts feeding into this atmosphere of, yeah, like tension and conflict before it's even arisen, because these people then try and buy the land they've been working on for a few years. And yes, actually sometimes what you find is people try and buy the land, and by the time the papers get put through, someone along the process has snuck in and been like, cool, if someone's trying to buy that bit of land, then maybe I should be buying that instead. So there's lots of these different tensions that arise rather than often direct conflict, particularly between different miners. I saw there was often, you might have cooperatives, but they're not cooperating. There's a bit of tension between the actors, even though they're not explicitly going and fighting each other. They're not happy if you do well, but they're also not looking to make you do any worse off. So it's interesting, the narratives that you see on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, there's conflict. I mean, 2 years ago, back home in Ghana, there was a ban on small-scale mining because, well, media had it that the miners were polluting the environment and all that. And, you know, these large-scale miners were working whilst the small-scale miners were asked to put a halt on what they were doing. So they were not happy about all of this. So, of course, there's conflict all the time because I mean, it's not fair when you're asked to stop your job.
Just one last point, which I find, I mean, for us, it's been really, really difficult to build a case because all of these initiatives, I mean, they start off, you know, you have to almost convince people that there is a livelihoods dimension. And, you know, the Minamata Convention, yeah, there is a lot of stuff mentioned on livelihoods, but the impetus behind it has been to ban mercury, an environmental issue. We're dealing with the OECD conflict minerals legislation, which is just, oh my goodness, you should see the people that at these conferences. It's like they've never seen a mine in their lives. It's unbelievable. So you're already, you know, to sort of compare it to a football match, you're already down 10-0 before you even get on the pitch. So it's all this negativity that you're battling. And, you know, the sector has, as a result, has been completely misbranded, and that's unfortunately misshaped a lot of this development policy that's aimed at you know, improving the livelihoods of these people. So,
thanks for the questions.
thanks.
Thank you.